Miriam lived an ordinary life. Yet, she had the extraordinary invitation to be the mother of the Messiah, the anointed one of God. And while living according to the Jewish covenant, she gave birth to the one who brought forth a new covenant. We could say that she was the umbilical cord between the two testaments. Now, let me remind you once again that the Gospels are not factual history, but in essence they are true stories of the faith people had in Jesus of Nazareth in the communities in which those Gospels were written. Now, the same is true about Mary. There is very little historical evidence about her, and even there are few Gospel citations. But those where she speaks with Jesus are puzzling. Do you remember the story of when Jesus was 12 years old and they went up to Jerusalem for the Passover festival? And when it was over, they went back to Nazareth in a caravan, and a day had passed, and Mary and Joseph realized Jesus wasn't with them. All that day they thought he was with other relatives. And when they found that out, they had to backtrack to Jerusalem to find him. And it took them 3 days, and there they found him in the temple. And the Jewish elders who were there were surprised at what he was asking them and what he was telling them. And Mary said to him, "Child, why have you treated us in this way? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And he responded, "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" There was another time. After he had chosen his disciples, he was invited to a wedding at Cana, and his mother was there also. And an embarrassing thing happened. They ran out of wine. And Mary said to him very quietly, "Son, they have no more wine." And he said, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." And then there was another incident when he was almost at the end of his ministry, and she had heard that he was acting very strange. In fact, people were saying that he was mentally disturbed. So she went with her sons and daughters and asked to see him. And instead of coming to them, he said to the crowd, "Those who do the will of my Father, they are my mother, my sisters, and my brothers." Now, it's my opinion that these curt responses of Jesus, so uncharacteristic, because he was known to treat women with equality, dignity, and sensitivity, were words scripted by the evangelists so as to be more culturally acceptable to the men. You see, there was a genuine fear that this new movement, where women were treated on an equal basis, would be judged as an effeminate religion. In the Greco-Roman world, a man's place was in the public sphere and a woman's place was in the home. And as soon as the church became acceptable by the Romans and took over these large monuments, the house churches were gradually closed down and the women were stripped of their functions. In less than 25 years after Jesus was no longer with the disciples, the old ways were resurrected. And before the end of the first century, male leadership was no longer interested in the contributions of the women in the Christian movement. But God works in mysterious ways. As the ranks of the Greco-Roman converts swelled, They insisted on retrieving a semblance of the ancient mother goddess. And to quell this clamor, the men of the church decided that the one best to fill that void would be the mother of their Savior. As I said, God works in mysterious ways, and around the same time, without urging from the hierarchy, women, with Mary as their model, began to dedicate their lives to Christ, not marry or bear children. So by the 2nd century, this ascetic movement was an about face from traditional patriarchal marriage, and this whole new lifestyle for women freed them. It freed them from the imposition of men. It afforded them an opportunity to become educated, to cultivate their minds and their talents. Religious women became empowered by associating with other women in self-governed communities. Proof positive that women could be autonomous and self-defined. It was only after large numbers of women chose this way of life that the church leaders sought to encroach themselves and mightily fought to regulate and rule the women monasteries and abbeys. Oh, what a web to weave when myth is taken as creed. The early fathers declared that we were all born with original sin, and that even marital sex was tainted. These teachings posed problems concerning Mary and the birth of Jesus. Well, what they did is they proclaimed Mary a perpetual virgin. And to support this, the early church taught that even though the Gospels mention that Jesus had brothers and sisters, the church says no, they really weren't brothers and sisters, they were cousins. Because you see, there's no word in Greek for cousin. Now that was a fallacy. There is indeed a word for cousins in Greek, and we can find it in the New Testament, and it's nepsios. Now, there are many biblical citations in which the brothers and sisters of Jesus are mentioned, and the earliest one was Paul. Paul wrote a letter to the Galatians, and he wrote, I went up to Jerusalem to see Cephas, and I stayed with him for 15 days. But the whole time I saw none of the other apostles except James, the brother of the Lord. Theologian Udo Rank Heinemann wants us to be aware of how tragic it must be for Mary and Joseph to have the church wipe out the existence of their other biological children. Well, there's another doctrine on Mary, and it's called the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, where we are to believe that Mary is conceived without sin. I find that no problem because I think all of us are conceived without sin. What mother doesn't and father look upon their child and not see the divinity and purity and innocence in that child? I do not accept the veracity of original sin. And I fail to see sexual intimacy between two consenting adults who are in love and are faithful to one another as sinful. There is another teaching on Mary, and it says that she was assumed, body and soul, into heaven. Well, that could be, but she was a human being. Like all other human beings, she died, and I think her body was buried. But I think what could have happened here is that those who were around Mary at the time, ministering to her, probably saw her spirit rising from her body. I understand people have seen this, and it is a very awesome experience.